Thank you again for making the time. We really appreciate being able to speak with you. And just to start, we've been collecting secret hobbies. And so I'm wondering if you can share something you absolutely love doing outside of work that your colleagues would never suspect.
Well, secret. Um, I think the hobby that I would share here starts from the depths of abysmal failure. A few years ago, I thought I need plants for my home, and I went down to this really bougie plant store on Bayshore, um, and the plants are really expensive. And I bought some beautiful plants. They were unusual, and they probably all died within 9 months. But since then, I've learned about the beauty and the poetry of California succulents. And we are in the middle of this pandemic, and it's been, I think, really instructive, and it's something that I've embraced. Putting the brakes on travel, something that I did a lot of, and I've done a lot of walks locally, and it's been beautiful to go local. And what I've done is source my garden through pickings. Why pay for plants when all around, because I live around Bernal Heights, around Potrero Hill, around Mission and Noe Valley, when there's so many beautiful things that nature provides that can be grown.
Good to hear it. And if I see you in the neighborhood, I'll know to keep an eye out on the bushes out front. So, we want to talk about that moment you're describing, this pandemic moment. Um, What do you consider, given
Mhm.
everything that's happened, to be your mandate for 2021? What's shifted because of the past year?
Wow. Well, we're getting right into it. And before I go on, I want to say, Dwayne, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and you've started at NCG, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the community and say how delightful it is to have you at the helm of NCG. And in the normal course of things, we would have probably met 4 or 5 times by now. And there's a really great article about entire categories of friendships that have been obliterated because of this pandemic. But when I just look at your background, coming from the San Francisco Foundation, running the PACE initiative, and then working at Policy Link on economic development policy, working at HUD and sustainable livelihoods, and then finally at Race Forward on institutional and sectoral change. It's an amazing body of work. And it's exactly the perspective I believe that's on point for NCG. So
Well,
there's so much that's about finding the right leaders for the right times. And I think if all of us, if I were waiting in the waiting room about to interview for a job, and you walked out with a smile on your face, I'd just walk out with you and probably buy you coffee. So, great job to NCG, and so excited to see what comes. But let's get down to I guess the grist of it is when I think about the challenges for our society and the challenges for philanthropy, and also I believe the challenges that we're facing and embracing head on at the Levi Strauss Foundation. It's two things: democracy
mm,
and structural racism. And it's really interesting to look at these two pillars. They're huge, they're big, um, and they also have some contrasts. I think people love talking about democracy. People don't like talking about racism. John Powell, who we all love, just makes a joke saying, "I'm going to invite you over to my house. We're going to have a get together. We're going to talk about racism. Good luck having people come over."
oh,
Um, and at the same time, I think when it comes to structural racism and democracy, they're as ubiquitous as the air, but they're both hard to talk about in many ways. I think as recent events have shown, we know when democracy is a threat, and we know when the lava erupts. I think these are the two prevailing challenges. Um, I hail from the Levi Strauss Foundation, and to work for a company that has, I guess, beyond the grant making that we provide, a different set of assets. Being a 169-year-old company, that's really a part of the fabric of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's also not lost on us that we're an American icon,
mm.
and as an American icon, what we say about America matters. So it's one thing to say, let's talk about structural racism, let's talk about democracy. The whole American project, going back to John Powell, is who is in the we. And there's a lot of contention, a lot of discussion. Um, we want to take this platform to talk about who is in the we, and to really stand for an America that mirrors the values that we believe in, which are originality, empathy, integrity, and courage. And I think what we've seen is a very high-pitched contention, a battle, if you will, for the soul of this nation. And it's a matter of which America are we contending for and are we building? I think what we saw with the playbook of number 45, he shall not be named, is that we have two choices. We can either take groups that are marginalized in society, that are already vulnerable, and segregate, separate, vilify, right? And that playbook we saw played frighteningly well in many ways. The other part is we can take our democracy and organize it around the protection of society's most weak and vulnerable. So when it comes to, I think when it comes to democracy, we'll get into this later in the nitty gritty, as well as structural racism. I think these are the things that matter most to us. There's a lot of different ways to do this. But when it comes to being a moral compass right now, this conversation of intervening in the narrative of America, and what that means, in many ways, structural racism is perhaps the greatest threat to democracy. So making these connections and inviting people in as an American icon, to this greater we conversation of who is in the we. That's a different type of invitation, and we really hope to build on that.
I want to touch on that a bit, but it struck me while you were talking that the two Americas you were describing, we saw 150 million people vote in this last election cycle, which is a record number, and close to 50 million people still didn't vote. And so in some ways, we don't know what the verdict is because we haven't found a way to get those voices in the moments when we make a statement to stand up. And so I think it's not just those two sides you're talking about, but it's the people who have not been moved to make their call, to make their choice. So I really appreciate that. How have you seen others in corporate philanthropy situate their response to the moment that's calling for racial justice? Has that become easier for corporations to do or more complicated given the events of 2020?
Right. Well, I want to sort of wind back to the events of the past 4 years, where, when 4 years ago, politics was a bit of a third rail for corporations. It was this idea that you don't want to touch politics with a 10-foot pole. And I think the exigencies of the most disruptive moment in modern, American history that we've lived through the past 4 years have forced many corporations to get out of that glass house, to get out of that shell. And we saw many corporations, I think the dominoes started dropping with the Muslim ban, with DACA. And we've seen in the face of gridlock and inaction in the face of government, I think many companies seizing an opportunity to lead on unaddressed issues. So it's been a very pleasant surprise for me to see that corporations have sometimes outpaced public policy when it comes to climate change, when it comes to issues of immigration, issues of civil rights, and especially immigration, and recently on gun safety. So it's been good to see that this realm of business and politics is no longer taboo, but we're seeing a place where businesses are realizing it's part of what we do to weigh in on what matters. What we're hoping to see as a company and as a values-based company is to see more and more companies pair their advocacy, their voice, their influence, their incredible channels and audiences that they have with targeted investments in the community. It's still a frontier. It's still seen as, social movements, that's a terrain of risk. And what we've learned in the past 4 years, that it's very much a terrain of opportunity. So to be able to, I think, to pair that voice and influence with investments in the community would really be, I think, an important progression.
I want to touch on something you mentioned about corporations getting ahead of, if you will, elected officials on some of these issues. Why the reluctance from elected officials? It almost feels like there's a world frame of what corporations want that is still holding elected officials, elected leadership from embracing the reality of the moment. And I wonder is that because not enough corporations have done this? Is it just a lag in recognizing where the field is going? do you have any sense of why it is there's almost a disconnect between corporate interest and some of our elected officials?
Mm. Well, I think my own personal commentary is that for the most part, the policy making was done at the federal level with one policymaker and a slate of executive actions that we saw starting to roll out 4 years ago. So I would say, in the face of when we see a lot of social change is instigated by bad things happening, it's either egregious violations against a person or a group of people, or a policy that's mean spirited. And we saw a whole slew of these mean spirited policies. I would say almost all of these came from executive actions, like defining transgender people out of existence, like family separation. What I would say is that when it came to much of the rest of government, there was a lot of gridlock and inaction. And the lack of a moral compass to take action around the epidemic of gun violence. That was one reason why our CEO, Chip Berg, really gathered himself, looked at this issue carefully, and realized we need to take a stand. But we do realize that we are a mission-driven company, that we have a mantra called profits through principles. So our mission as a company is to drive profits through principles to have an outsized impact on the world. And we realize that by standing beside communities that have been in the crosshairs of the Muslim ban, of DACA, of the policies, the whole slew of policies directed against trans folks, that has been part of our calling. And silence is no longer an option. And I think that's something that the corporate sector is grappling with.
Like, you're saying it's a marathon, not a sprint. I think the truth is it's a marathon with a series of sprints, and we just have to be able to figure out how to move those sprints and move between those to keep them going. You asked about the government work. The thing that we always observed in working with these institutions that have a reputation for, shall we say, a slow pace of change, that we had to learn how to move with alacrity and move as if people's lives depended on it, because they did, even as you hold the long game, right? And that it's this sense of, you can't have a burst of energy and movement and activity and then think you're done, because the work is generational. But we can't rely on the next generation to get the work done. And so I think what you're lifting up is that duality and how we move this work. Talking about your team, where are they at their edges? What have they been making of their role in terms of helping connect with communities as they deal with sheltering and financial hardship, the racial reckoning? What's the challenge for your team in doing this work right now?
I'm very proud. I feel I have a bit of a crusade, within Levi Strauss. I have probably one of the most diverse teams, almost all immigrants or people of color. I think the most excellent team. And this idea that diverse teams do the best, that has been borne out through my experience. And we are only 6 people at the Levi Strauss Foundation. And when we think about what this foundation is, this lever of change between this company and a whole array of stakeholders, and in corporate philanthropy, there's a lot of them. It's our board of our foundation, it's company employees, the leadership, and on top of that, of course, and primarily, is how we serve the community. So, how we find voice and occupied voice, and in many ways be in our full power in the gray spaces. That's really what it takes to thrive every day. And all of the things that people have been facing when it comes to attacks on communities, the gut punch of some of the executive orders that we felt, the suffering that people have felt in the midst of this pandemic. These are things that we all feel within our team, and we've been there for one another. I also know that I've had immigrant parents and Korean parents who have gone through like several diasporas. My goal right now, as far as moving forward, is to I think prepare my incredible team for what's to come. I believe the future is bright for our foundation, but also to give them oxygen and breathing room in the midst of this crisis and a transition.
As you conclude your journey in this CEO role, any message for a CEO just beginning that process with the team?
First thing I want to say is, I went through in my 12 years as a leader of this foundation so much deer in the headlights, Dwayne, of who am I to be in this role? da 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 da. And then, when I look back at it and realize that when I started in this role, it was 94.6% of all foundation CEOs that were not white. I would walk in a room at a philanthropic conference, people would sort of just look at me and assume I was an administrative assistant or something. And you see the unconscious bias about the way people are treated, and that this question of what do you do, it isn't even asked, even though that's not always a good question to ask. So my counsel first is that you belong in the position and that this sector needs us. We need to be out loud and proud. We need to be in our full spaces, our full power in those gray spaces, as we spoke about. I got really good advice when I started in my job from Bob Haas, who is the president of our foundation for 24 years. He's also the great grandnephew of Levi Strauss, and was the CEO of Levi Strauss and Company. So when I started, he pulled me aside and he said, first of all, don't get comfortable in this role. Never get comfortable in this role, because remember where change comes from, and those are the margins. You cut your teeth in social movements. Don't forget who you are, and don't get comfortable. At the same time, he was also telling me that I belonged. And I want to also just a shout out to the traditions that came before me, that I was the fourth person of color in a row to occupy this. So that really, as far as intentionality, having this sense that the people who ought to be hired to do this work, the people closest to the problems, as Serena Khan has said, are the ones creating the solutions. They've really made it a place for me to not feel like I have to be an imposter in that. He also said, if there is a metaphor that I want this foundation to be, I want it to be jazz. Jazz is perhaps the only American, the greatest American, uniquely American art form. And it really is about different folks playing the same song with different interpretations and making something beautiful. He said, I don't want this to be symphony. And he also said, I want you to zig when the company zags and focus on the long term of social change. They might get it 5 or 10 or 15 years later. So when it came to our initial fight against HIV and AIDS, and the courage that took, or I would say our support for emerging social justice leaders through the Pioneers in Justice Initiative, right. That was a really frontier initiative 10 years ago. But now it's everything, how we engage with those at the helm of social movements. So I would say it is really important for leaders when they're new to do two things. Number one, figure out your 10 commandments. Your values, your loyalty to your mission, your loyalty to the legacy of your organization. And then number two, jump off a cliff. Figure out what it means to take risks and to not be afraid.
Well, that brings us to our final question. I'm very curious to hear, how are you finding joy, particularly in these times?
This has been a really interesting year, a really tough year. I'm finding joy. It's interesting. This type of role, just has so many sort of faces and hats to it. And I'm actually an introvert. I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, with 2 horses, 2 dogs, and 2 cats on 10 acres of land, and I'm very much an introvert. It's been a really interesting moment to sort of get in touch with who I am as an introvert and what it means to lead in that space. So I've really enjoyed, in many ways, getting to know the 4 walls of my apartment instead of the route map of United Airlines. I mean, before it would be sitting in the airplane where I would feel that was a sanctum of solitude, where the one place where no one could reach me, and I didn't have to wear a hat, and I could just be me. But I've really enjoyed focusing on home furnishings. I've enjoyed going on walks in my neighborhood all around in every direction. And of course, I've enjoyed the wonderful succulents that I picked up along the way.
That might be where we have crossed paths before on some overnight United flight back to DC or Chicago, because I fully hear you on that front. Um, I can't wait to see what happens next for you. I hope you are able to take a moment to celebrate what you've contributed to the field. Thank you for these insights today and for whatever it is you're going to bring to us in the months and years to come. Much appreciated.